Here is what you need to know about the night Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's career broke in half. She brought a binder, a big one, thick leather-bound bristling with color-coded tabs, the kind of binder that says, "I came prepared," the way a peacock's tail says, "I am worthy of your attention." She carried it on stage like a trial lawyer carries a briefcase, like it contained the evidence that would bury her opponent and vindicate everything she had ever said on every platform that had ever given her a microphone. And when J.D. Vance calmly, almost gently, the way you'd ask a friend to settle a bar tab, asked her to open that binder and name one single thing she had actually accomplished, she opened it. She flipped through it. On live television, in a silent room in Youngstown, Ohio. For 15 seconds, that felt like 15 years. She found nothing. Or rather, she found exactly what was in there. Talking points, proposals, resolutions, frameworks, aspirational language, and discovered in the worst possible moment that none of it was an answer. "A resolution isn't a law," Vance said. "It's a wish. Try again." She did not try again. But that moment, the binder moment, as the internet would cruelly and permanently name it, did not come out of nowhere. It was the final act of an evening that had been from the very beginning a slow and methodical and almost elegant dismantling. And to appreciate just how thoroughly things fell apart for the Congresswoman from New York's 14th District, you have to start at the beginning when she walked into that auditorium with her film crew and her binder and her certainty, and the audience still thought they were going to see a debate. The town hall was held in Youngstown, Ohio, in an auditorium that used to host union rallies back when there were enough union members to fill it. The seats were the old kind, wooden creaky, bolted to a floor that remembered decades of steel-toed boots. The local PBS affiliate had organized the event under a title so bland it practically begged to be ignored: "The Future of the American Working Class, a Bipartisan Conversation." It was supposed to be a civilized, policy-focused exchange between Vice President J.D. Vance and Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, moderated by a veteran journalist named Helen Marsh, who had covered enough political bloodbaths to know this would not stay civilized for long. The audience was 800 strong. No stacking, no pre-screening, just people from the Mahoning Valley and surrounding counties who showed up early enough to get a seat. Factory workers, nurses, diner owners, retirees, living on fixed incomes, and a cluster of college students from Youngstown State who had arrived in matching green T-shirts and immediately regretted sitting next to a row of retired steelworkers who looked at them like they were from another planet. AOC entered first. She walked in with the practiced energy of someone who had done 1,000 rooms, shoulders back, chin up a wave, that managed to look simultaneously spontaneous and choreographed. Her team trailed behind her, a communications director already thumbing a phone, a videographer capturing behind-the-scenes content for what would later become the most regrettable Instagram story of the year. She carried a thick binder under one arm. She smiled at the college section. They cheered. The rest of the room offered polite, measured applause, the kind you give at a funeral when someone says something nice about the deceased, but you're not sure you agree. Vance came in through a side door. No entourage, no binder. He shook hands with a man in the front row, a retired pipe fitter named Gerald, who later told a reporter he hadn't voted in 12 years, but came tonight because the vice president grew up 20 minutes from my house, and I wanted to see if he still remembered. Vance remembered. He asked about Gerald's knee surgery. Gerald looked stunned that he knew. Helen Marsh called the room to order, laid out the format: opening statements, audience questions, direct exchange, and the evening began. AOC opened strong. She always opened strong. She spoke about the hollowing out of the American middle class with the kind of controlled fury that had made her a star, the corporate greed, the tax loopholes, the politicians who visited places like Youngstown every 4 years, and then forgot they existed. She gestured toward the shuttered mills visible through the auditorium's high windows. She invoked the Green New Deal as a lifeline for communities exactly like this one. And then she turned to Vance with a line that landed like a jab. My colleague across the stage wrote a best-selling book about the pain of places like this, and then spent his career making sure nothing changed. He turned suffering into a brand, and the people in this room are still suffering. The college section erupted. A few fists pumped. AOC allowed herself a small, satisfied nod. From the fourth row, a voice low gravelly, not shouting, but carrying cut through the applause. An old man 70, if he was a day wearing a faded steelworkers local 1-462 cap, said loud enough for the nearest microphone to catch, "She's never set foot here before tonight." A ripple went through the room. Not laughter, not anger, something more dangerous. Recognition. AOC heard it. Her eyes flickered toward the voice for a fraction of a second, then back to the camera. She smiled, but the rhythm was broken. The narrator of history would later note the first crack appeared before the debate had truly begun, and it did not come from Vance. It came from the room itself. Vance stood. He did not match her energy. He spoke quietly, so quietly that people in the back rows leaned forward to hear, which was, of course, the point. "I'm not going to give a speech," he said. "I grew up about 20 minutes from here. My grandmother raised me in a house that smelled like cigarettes and Vicks VapoRub and something she was always frying. I don't need to explain this place to you. You are this place." He paused. "I didn't come here tonight to talk about myself. I came because the people in this room deserve to hear the truth about what's actually been done in their name and what hasn't. And I think by the end of tonight, we'll all have a much clearer picture of who's been fighting for you and who's been performing for the cameras." It landed softly, almost too softly. But there was something underneath it, a weight, a direction, a promise that the evening had a destination, and he already knew the route. Helen Marsh glanced at her notes. The audience settled. Both fighters had entered the ring. One came to perform. The other came to prosecute. The first audience question came from a woman named Diane, a laid-off auto parts worker with hands that told a story her words didn't need to. She stood at the floor microphone and asked the simplest, most devastating question a politician can face. "What have either of you actually done for people like me?" AOC pivoted smoothly to her legislative record. She cited co-sponsored bills, a Clean Energy Transition Act, a federal jobs guarantee proposal, a workers' rights resolution. She spoke with specificity that suggested preparation, rattling off bill numbers and committee assignments with the fluency of someone who had rehearsed this exact moment. Vance listened. He wrote something on a notepad. When it was his turn, he did not attack her record. Instead, he looked at Diane. "Did any of that help you personally?" Diane shook her head. "No, sir." "Did it help anyone you know?" "Not that I've heard of." The room was very quiet. AOC jumped in. Systemic change takes time. Structural reforms don't produce overnight results. The Republican obstruction machine blocks progressive legislation before it can take effect. Vance nodded almost sympathetically. "It's been 6 years," he said. "At what point does systemic change takes time just become another way of saying, I don't have results?" Diane sat down. She did not look at AOC. The second question came from a college student in a green t-shirt friendly territory for AOC. He asked about climate policy, and she delivered the answer she was born to give. The passion was real, the statistics were polished, the moral urgency was palpable. She painted a picture of coastal flooding, crop failure, climate refugees, and a generation inheriting a planet on fire. The student section applauded with the fervor of people who had found their champion. Vance did not argue with the science. He did not deny climate change. He did something far more effective. He asked her a math question. You've called for the elimination of fossil fuel jobs in multiple public statements. There are 800 people in this room. I'd be willing to bet at least 200 of them work in industries your Green New Deal would either eliminate or fundamentally restructure. Can you tell me right now to their faces how many of them would lose their current job under your plan, AOC deflected? Transition jobs, federal retraining programs, clean energy employment projections that showed net job growth by 2035. Vance let her finish. That's a beautiful brochure answer, but I asked you a number. How many people in this room lose their job? You don't know, do you? She started to respond. And here's a follow-up. How many of those retraining programs have you personally visited? Silence. I've reviewed the data extensively. That's a no. From the working class rose a sound not quite laughter but close, a dry, knowing exhale that rippled through the seats the way a breeze moves through tall grass. 3 or 4 people shook their heads. A woman crossed her arms. The college section was quieter now. Not hostile but uncertain, the way an audience gets when the person they came to support has stumbled and they're not sure if she'll recover. AOC regrouped. She was too experienced to let a single exchange define the night, and she knew where Vance was vulnerable. She went on the offensive. Let's talk about contradictions, Mr. Vice President. You wrote a book about poverty in Appalachia, a bestseller. You became the voice of the forgotten working class. And then, what did you do? You went to Yale Law School. You became a venture capitalist. You invested in tech companies in Silicon Valley. And then you ran for Senate, backed by Peter Thiel's money. You wrote a book about being poor, and then became everything your book warned against. That's not a rags-to-riches story, that's a betrayal wrapped in a book deal. The line was razor-sharp. The delivery was impeccable. Even the steelworkers section gave a grudging murmur of appreciation, not for her politics, but for the craftsmanship. It was the kind of moment that would have dominated the news cycle in any other debate. Vance took it. He nodded. He even smiled, not the politician's smile, but the weary half-grin of a man who'd heard this attack 1,000 times and had long since made peace with it. I won't apologize for going to law school or for building businesses. I invested in companies that created jobs in Ohio, not in New York, not in California, in Ohio. Would you like me to name them? He didn't wait for an answer. But since you raised the subject of contradictions, let's agree on something. Let's agree that a person's credibility is measured by whether their actions match their words. Fair? Of course. Good. I'll hold you to that. He moved on. He asked Helen Marsh for the next question. And as the moderator called on another audience member, the narrator of history would note what the cameras could not fully capture the expression on AOC's face in the moment after Vance said, "I'll hold you to that." It was not fear exactly. It was the look of someone who has just heard a door lock behind them and is not yet sure which side they're on. The pattern was becoming visible to those who cared to look. AOC fought in the moment, reactive, emotional, sharp, built for the highlight reel. Vance fought across time. Every question, every answer, every seeming concession was a brick in a structure that was not yet visible. She was winning rounds. He was building a case. It began with Amazon. Vance did not rush into it. He waited for a question about economic development, a softball from a small business owner asking what could be done to attract employers to the region. AOC gave her answer, and it was fine. Boilerplate about community investment, public-private partnerships, incentivizing green industry. Then Vance spoke. I agree with much of what the Congresswoman said about attracting employers. I do. The disagreement isn't about whether we want jobs, it's about whether we're willing to accept them when they actually show up. He let that sit for 2 full seconds. In 2019, Amazon announced plans to build a second headquarters in Long Island City, in the Congresswoman's home state of New York. 25,000 jobs. Average salary, $150,000. Not executive positions, project managers, administrative staff, logistics, coordinators, maintenance workers, cafeteria employees. Working people, the kind of people both of us say we fight for. He turned to AOC. The city had negotiated $3 billion in tax incentives over 25 years. In return, Amazon would have generated an estimated $27 billion in tax revenue. That's a 9-to-1 return. Any business owner in this room would take that deal in a heartbeat. The Congresswoman didn't take the deal. She celebrated when Amazon pulled out. She posted on social media, I believe the word she used was victory. She stood in front of cameras and said the people of Queens had won. Vance paused. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. I talked to some of those people. Not on camera. Not for a press release. Just talked to them. A man named Miguel ran a small restaurant 2 blocks from the proposed site. He'd signed a 5-year lease expansion because he believed the headquarters was coming. When Amazon pulled out, he couldn't sustain the overhead. Closed within 8 months. A woman named Patricia Singlemother worked in commercial cleaning. She had been told there would be hundreds of cleaning and maintenance positions at the new campus. She's still waiting. He looked directly at AOC. You celebrated on Twitter the day their futures collapsed. You called it a victory for the people. I'd like to know which people, because it wasn't Miguel, and it wasn't Patricia. The room was not silent, it was pressurized. The college students stared at their shoes. A man in the 5th row union jacket, thick arms, nodded slowly, the way people nod when they've known something for a long time and are hearing it confirmed by someone who matters. AOC fired back. Her voice was tight-controlled, urgent. That deal was corporate welfare. $3 billion in taxpayer money handed to the richest company on the planet, run by the richest man on the planet. The people of New York didn't need Jeff Bezos's charity. They needed structural investment in their own communities, not a sweetheart deal that would have driven up rents and displaced longtime residents. $27 billion in tax revenue, Vance said quietly. You turned down $27 billion because opposing it made a good Instagram video. The number hung in the air like a verdict. And by the way, the rents went up anyway. Queens gentrified without the jobs. You got the displacement without the employment. That's not a victory. That's the worst of both worlds. From the audience, Vance asked a question that was not a question. He turned to face the crowd. Raise your hand if you'd take a corporate welfare job that pays $150,000 a year. Hands went up. Not all at once, first the front rows, then the middle, then the back, like a wave. The steelworkers, the nurses, the retirees, the small business owners, even a few of the college students, sheepishly as though betraying a cause they had not fully thought through. The narrator of this story will not attempt to count the hands because precision would diminish the image. It is enough to say Nearly every hand in the room went up, and AOC watched it happen. She had argued against a deal that every person in this room would have begged for, and now they knew it. And worse, now she knew they knew. Vance did not gloat. He simply said, "Let's move on." And that restraint was more devastating than any follow-up could have been. But he did not move on. Not really. He moved deeper. Since we agreed earlier that credibility is measured by whether actions match words, I want to talk about something that happened in September 2021. The Congresswoman attended the Met Gala. For those who don't know, it's an annual fashion event in New York, where tickets cost $35,000 apiece, and the guest list reads like a Forbes ranking. The Congresswoman wore a white gown with the words, "Tax the Rich," painted across the back. It was by any measure a brilliant piece of political theater. He spoke the next words with something that almost sounded like admiration. The image went everywhere. It became iconic. It was the kind of moment that builds a brand, and the Congresswoman is very, very good at building brands. Then the tone shifted. But here's what the brand didn't show. The dress was designed by Aurora James, a designer whose company at the time owed the IRS significant back taxes. A company that had been hit with tax liens in multiple states. A company where former employees alleged publicly in news reports that they weren't paid on time or in full. He let that settle. So the message on the dress was, "Tax the rich." The designer who made the dress wasn't paying her own taxes. And the workers who sewed the dress allegedly weren't being paid. You can't write satire that good. Laughter, real unguarded laughter, erupted from the working-class rows. Not cruel laughter. The laughter of recognition. The laughter that comes when someone says out loud what you've been thinking privately for years. AOC's voice cut through it sharp and defensive. That's a complete mischaracterization. Aurora James is a black woman entrepreneur who... I'm not questioning her race or her gender. I'm questioning her payroll. There's a difference. The laughter stopped. The silence that replaced it was heavier. Vance continued. After the gala, a woman, a seamstress who worked on that dress, reached out to the Congresswoman's office. She said she hadn't been fully compensated for her work on the gown. She sent an email to the office's public contact address. Then a follow-up. Then a third. He paused. She never heard back. Not once. The woman who wore a dress that said, "Tax the rich," couldn't be bothered to respond to the woman who sewed it. I have the correspondence. He placed a thin manila folder on the podium. He did not open it. He did not need to. The fact that it existed was enough. And the way AOC's eyes locked onto it, the way her body stiffened, the way her hands gripped the edges of her own podium, told the room everything the folder itself might have contained. "That's a smear," AOC said. "You're constructing a narrative. I'm reading you your own story. If it sounds like a smear, maybe the story is the problem." Vance shifted gears. His voice became almost gentle, which was somehow more devastating than anger. "I want to say something that might surprise you. I genuinely admire the Congresswoman's story. A bartender from the Bronx who ran a grassroots campaign and unseated a 10-term incumbent. That takes courage. That takes conviction. That is the American dream, and I mean that." The audience softened. Even AOC seemed momentarily disarmed. But somewhere along the way, the mission changed. The bartender who spoke for the working class started driving a Tesla while publicly attacking the man who makes them. The champion of public housing moved into an upscale apartment in one of D.C.'s most expensive neighborhoods. The voice of the people started showing up to $35,000 galas wearing custom designer gowns. He turned to her. About 40 minutes ago, you stood at that podium and told this room that my success was a contradiction. That going from poverty to Yale to venture capital made me a hypocrite. You said those exact words, so let's apply that same standard. If my trajectory from poverty to success is a betrayal, what do you call yours? The room held its breath. AOC opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. I never said people can't be successful. No, you said I was a contradiction. Those were your words. 40 minutes ago. In this room. To these people. The murmur that rolled through the audience was not polite. It was not restrained. It was the sound of 800 people reaching the same conclusion at the same time. And that conclusion was not favorable to the woman standing at the left podium. The moderator, Helen Marsh, sensing the shift, called for a brief intermission. Vance shook his head. We don't need a break. We need to finish this. Helen looked at AOC, whose expression suggested she very much wanted that break. Then Helen looked at the audience, who were already leaning forward in their seats, with the body language of people who had no intention of going anywhere. We'll continue, Helen said. What happened next would become the most replayed 90 seconds of political television that year, not because of what was said, but because of what was not. AOC, sensing that the emotional ground had shifted beneath her, attempted the only maneuver left in her arsenal, the policy pivot. She pulled the debate back to legislation, specific bills, specific committee votes. She spoke rapidly with the precision of someone trying to build a fortress out of facts before the next wave hit. She cited the Green Infrastructure and Jobs Act, a bill she had co-authored that allocated federal funding for renewable energy projects in underserved communities. She cited the Workers' First Agenda, a package of labor protections she had championed. She named vote counts, committee hearings, bipartisan outreach efforts that had been blocked by Republican leadership. It was, by any objective measure, a competent legislative defense. On a different night, against a different opponent, it might have worked. Vance listened to every word. Then he pulled out a single sheet of paper. I appreciate the Congresswoman's legislative passion. Let me read back what she just cited. The Green Infrastructure and Jobs Act allocated $4 billion to climate research and $200 million to job retraining. $4 billion for research, $200 million for the people in this room. You're telling working Americans that their jobs are worth 5 cents on every dollar you spend. He set the paper down. The Workers' First Agenda introduced in committee never made it to a floor vote. The bipartisan outreach, I checked. The only Republican co-sponsor withdrew after the Congresswoman publicly called him a fossil fuel puppet on social media 2 weeks later. That's not outreach. That's sabotage. AOC's jaw tightened. She started to respond, but Vance was already moving to the next blow. There was a congressman, a Democrat, not a Republican, named David Hernandez, from a swing district in Pennsylvania. He asked the Congresswoman's caucus to support a bipartisan infrastructure bill that would have brought a manufacturing plant to his district, 1,200 jobs. The bill included a provision for a natural gas processing component, not a drilling operation, a processing facility for gas that was already being extracted. He paused. The Congresswoman's faction killed it. Purity test. David Hernandez lost his seat the following November by 3 points. Those 1,200 jobs never materialized. And the people in his district, the ones who were counting on those jobs, they didn't get retraining. They didn't get transition assistance. They got nothing. From the back of the auditorium, a voice, a man's voice ragged with something that sounded like years of accumulated frustration, shouted, "That's right!" The dam was breaking. You talk about solidarity, Vance said, and his voice was steady, almost sad. But your solidarity has a purity test, and the people who fail it aren't billionaires or lobbyists. They're working people in swing districts who needed a factory more than they needed your approval. AOC was rattled now anyone could see it. Her gestures were sharper, her voice pitched higher. And then she made the mistake that would define her career. She turned away from the audience. She turned away from Vance. She looked directly into the nearest camera. Not the people in the room, but the lens, the audience at home, the algorithm, and delivered a monologue that was clearly designed not for Youngstown, Ohio, but for Twitter, for Instagram, for the clip that would go viral before the town hall was over. This is what they do. This is the playbook. They take a woman of color who dares to challenge power, who dares to speak truth to a system built on exploitation, and they try to tear her down piece by piece. They cherry-pick facts, they manufacture scandals, they parade sob stories designed to distract from the real issue, which is that the billionaire-class congresswoman. Vance's voice was calm, almost kind, and that kindness was the sharpest blade of the night. I'm not tearing you down because of your race or your gender. I'm reading you your own record. If your record is tearing you down, that's not my fault. The audience erupted. Not the college section, they sat frozen, some with mouths open, some staring at the floor. The eruption came from everywhere else. The steelworkers, the nurses, the retirees, the small business owners. Even Diane, the auto parts worker, who had asked the first question of the night, was on her feet. But the standing ovation stopped when another voice rose above it. A woman in the 7th row stood. She was black, mid-50s, wearing hospital scrubs under an unzipped jacket. Her name tag read Brenda. She did not shout. She did not need to. The room quieted for her the way a room quiets for someone whose authority comes not from a title, but from a life lived. I have something to say. Helen Marsh gestured for her to approach the floor microphone. She did with the unhurried dignity of a woman who had spent 30 years walking hospital corridors at 3 in the morning. I'm a nurse. I've been a nurse for 29 years. I'm also a black woman. And I need to say this directly. She looked at AOC. Don't use my skin color as your shield. I didn't come here tonight to watch you play the race card when you can't answer a question. I came here to find out who's going to help my patients keep their insurance and my neighbors keep their jobs. Answer the question. The sound that followed was not applause. It was something more primal, a collective exhalation, the release of a pressure that had been building all evening. Some people stood. Some clapped. Some simply nodded over and over, the way people nod when a truth they've been carrying alone is finally spoken aloud by someone else. AOC stood at her podium, her team visible in the wings, their phones no longer recording exchanged glances of the kind that only people in crisis exchange. The videographer had lowered his camera. The communications director had stopped typing. There are blows you can recover from, and there are blows that rewrite the story. This was the second kind, because the most devastating indictment of the evening had not come from J.D. Vance. It had come from the very community AOC claimed to represent, and there is no political playbook for that. Helen Marsh, sensing that the evening had reached a point of no return, tried to steer toward closing statements. But Vance had one more question, and it was the question the entire evening had been building toward. Congresswoman, you've been carrying that binder all night. You brought it to the podium. You've referenced it several times. I'd like you to open it. AOC's hand went to the binder, instinctively, protectively. Open it, and read me one specific accomplishment from your time in office. One bill that passed into law. One factory that opened because of your direct action. One job, just one that exists today, because of something you did. Not a resolution. Not a co-sponsorship. Not a committee hearing. A result. The room went silent. Not the comfortable silence of anticipation, but the airless silence of a room that has collectively stopped breathing. AOC opened the binder. She turned a page. Then another. Then another. The sound of paper, crisp, loud in the microphone, filled the auditorium the way a ticking clock fills a room at midnight. She stopped on a page, read it silently. Her lips moved, then stopped. The resolution on the Green New Deal framework established a national conversation about a resolution isn't a law. It's a wish. Try again. More pages. The rustling was louder now, or maybe the silence around it was deeper. In the fourth row, Gerald, the retired pipe fitter who had shaken Vance's hand at the entrance, lowered his head and rubbed his eyes not in grief, but in the exhausted recognition of something he had always suspected. 10 seconds passed. In a room of 800 people on live television, 10 seconds is an epoch. 15 seconds is a geological age. AOC closed the binder. She did not try again. The microphone still live caught the sound of her swallowing. It caught the slight tremor in her breathing. And across America, on every screen and speaker carrying the broadcast, the audience heard what Youngstown heard: the sound of someone who had built a career on words, discovering in the worst possible moment that she had run out of them. Vance said nothing. He did not need to. The binder, that thick, impressive, carefully carried binder that had been her prop and her shield and her symbol of preparation all evening, had turned out to be full of talking points, not results. And everyone in the room understood the difference. Helen Marsh closed the town hall at 9:47 p.m. Her voice was steady and professional, but those who knew her said later that her hands were shaking not from nerves, but from the adrenaline of having moderated something that had crossed the line from political event to public reckoning. The aftermath began immediately. Or rather, it began in two separate theaters, the room itself and the digital world that had been watching. In the room, AOC's team materialized around her like a protective formation. Her chief of staff appeared at her elbow, speaking rapidly into her ear. The videographer had packed his camera. No one was filming anymore. AOC did not cross the stage for the traditional post-event handshake. She walked quickly head forward, binder clutched to her chest, toward the backstage exit. A reporter from a local station called out a question. She did not turn. Backstage, the narrator of this story can only describe what was observed from a distance: a cluster of staffers standing in a hallway, phones buzzing with the fury of a hive that has been kicked, and at the center of that cluster, a congresswoman who was not speaking. Her chief of staff's phone rang continuously. She did not answer it. Someone handed AOC a bottle of water. She held it without drinking. The machine that had built Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez into a political brand, the machine that knew exactly what to post, what to clip, what to spin, had for the first time in its existence no idea what to do next. On stage, Vance had not moved. He stepped off the podium and walked into the audience. For the next 40 minutes, while the cameras packed up and the lights were dimmed section by section, he stood in the aisles and talked to anyone who wanted to talk. He spoke to Gerald about the pipe fitter's pension. He spoke to Diane about retraining options at the community college. He spoke to a young woman who said she had driven from Akron because she needed to see if any of these people were real. He asked her what she meant by real. She said, someone who actually listens instead of waiting for their turn to talk. Brenda, the nurse from the 7th row, was the last person to speak to him. She shook his hand and said simply, "I voted for her last time. I won't make that mistake again." Vance did not gloat. He did not campaign. He nodded and said, "Tell me what you need. I'm listening." And she did. For 6 minutes, on a dimming stage in an emptying auditorium, a nurse told the vice president about a hospital system that was breaking and a community that couldn't afford to wait for systemic change. He wrote it down, on paper, with a pen. The Internet, meanwhile, was doing what the Internet does. AOC's communications team, operating on instinct and muscle memory, clipped the woman of color challenging power moment and posted it across all platforms within 30 minutes of the event's conclusion. The framing was careful, her words defiantly delivered, with no context before or after. For 12 minutes it performed exactly as intended. Shares, retweets, fire emojis, solidarity, hashtags. Then the full exchange dropped. Someone in the audience, never identified, never credited, had recorded the entire sequence on a phone. AOC's turn to the camera, Vance's response, the eruption, Brenda's intervention, the binder moment, the silence. All of it. Unedited. 4 minutes and 37 seconds that dismantled the curated clip, the way a controlled demolition dismantles a building not in pieces, but all at once, floor by floor, until there was nothing left standing. Within 2 hours, the full clip had been viewed 11 million times. By midnight, it was the #1 trending topic on every platform that still had trending topics. By morning, it had a name. The Internet, with its gift for brutality disguised as humor, called it the binder moment, and the phrase entered the lexicon with the permanence of a tattoo. The parodies came next. A TikTok creator filmed himself flipping through an empty notebook, while his friend asked, "What have you accomplished?" It got 4 million views in a day. A late-night host held up a binder on air and said, "AOC brought a binder to a fact fight. That's like bringing a resume to a job you've already been fired from." A remix artist, the kind of person the Internet produces like a factory, produces widgets, took the 15 seconds of silence, looped the page-turning sound, and set it to lo-fi beats. It was improbably both devastating and oddly listenable. It charted on Spotify's viral playlist. The title was "Turning Pages, No Results Found." AOC did not post for 3 days. When she finally did a long Instagram video filmed in her apartment with the lighting of a confessional, the tone was defiant, but the energy was different. She spoke about systemic attacks on progressive women, about the manufactured nature of political theater, about refusing to be defined by a single night. It was well crafted. It was well delivered. Under normal circumstances, it would have reset the narrative. These were not normal circumstances. The comments section, historically, a fortress of unconditional support, moderated with the precision of a military operation, was fractured. Between the heart emojis and the "We stand with you" messages, a new kind of comment had appeared first, as a trickle, then as a current. Just answer the question. What have you actually accomplished? Open the binder. The moderators deleted them. They returned. Faster. The algorithm, which had spent years amplifying her content to audiences primed to agree, had detected a shift in engagement patterns, and was now, with the amoral efficiency of software, amplifying the dissent. The political fallout unfolded over the following week, with the slow, grinding inevitability of a landslide. A poll released 4 days after the town hall showed her approval among independent voters had dropped 11 points. Among Latino voters, under 40, once her most reliable demographic, the drop was 7 points. Among union households, a category she had never dominated but had always contested, she was now underwater by 19. 2 moderate Democrats, one from Virginia, one from Michigan, were asked on Sunday morning shows whether they considered AOC an asset to the party. Both gave answers that lasted less than 10 seconds and contained the phrase, "The party is bigger than any one individual." In Washington, that sentence is a eulogy delivered while the patient is still breathing. A member of the squad, her closest political ally, a woman she had championed and fundraised for and stood beside at 100 press conferences, appeared on a cable news panel 5 days after the town hall. When the host asked about the Youngstown exchange, the ally paused, tilted her head, and said, "I think there are important lessons for all of us about connecting with working-class voters." She then changed the subject to health care. The narrator would note that in politics, changing the subject is the quietest form of betrayal and the most irreversible. Two major donors, one a tech entrepreneur, one a media executive, quietly redirected their contributions away from AOC-aligned PACs. No public statements, no dramatic announcements, just the silent migration of money, which is the only sound that truly matters in American politics. The moderate Democrat she had once publicly called a corporate puppet with no backbone, a congressman from Ohio of all places, posted 4 words on social media the morning after the poll numbers dropped, "Chickens come home." He did not need to say more. The internet, already fluent in the language of political wreckage, understood perfectly. But the deepest wound was the one that had not yet fully opened. 2 weeks after the town hall, a reporter at a major national outlet, the kind of reporter who spends months on a single story, and whose calls make press secretaries lose sleep, published the first installment of what would become a 3-part investigation into the financial practices of AOC's campaign apparatus. The questions were not new. They had been asked before in smaller outlets by less credible voices, and they had been dismissed or ignored or buried under the weight of her media armor. The questions concerned irregularities in how campaign funds had been routed through affiliated PACs, discrepancies in expense reporting that were technically legal but optically catastrophic, and a pattern of payments to political consultants who also happened to be personal associates. None of this was proven. None of it had reached the level of formal investigation. But that was precisely the point. Before Youngstown, these questions had been unaskable, not because they were unimportant, but because the cost of asking them was too high. She was too popular, too media-savvy, too capable of turning any inquiry into a narrative about persecution. The armor had held for years. The town hall didn't create the questions. It removed the armor. And once the armor was gone, the questions that had been waiting in the dark for years finally had permission to step into the light. The narrator of this story does not know how those questions will be answered. That is a story for another night. What can be said is this: the investigation would not have been published 2 weeks earlier. The editor who greenlit it said as much privately to a colleague. Before Youngstown, he reportedly said, touching her was a career risk. After Youngstown, not touching her was a journalistic failure. J.D. Vance flew back to Washington the morning after the town hall. But before he left Youngstown, he stopped at a diner on Market Street, the kind of place with laminated menus and coffee that tastes like it was brewed during the previous administration. He sat at the counter. He ordered black coffee and toast. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with a name tag that read Carol, recognized him. She said she'd watched the town hall on her phone during her break. "What did you think?" he asked. She refilled his coffee without being asked. "I think you told the truth." He nodded. He drank his coffee. He left a 20 on the counter for a $4 tab, not because he was performing generosity for an audience, but because Carol's Diner was the kind of place that remembered, and he was the kind of man who wanted to be remembered correctly. He flew back to Washington. AOC did not return to the Capitol for 3 days. When she did the corridors that had once parted for her staffers, who wanted to be seen nearby, colleagues who angled for joint press conferences, reporters who competed for her quotes, were just corridors. The staffers looked at their phones. The colleagues found reasons to be elsewhere. The reporters still called, but the questions had changed. They were no longer asking what she thought about the issues of the day. They were asking her to respond to the investigation. They were asking about the binder. They were asking her the same question Vance had asked, the question Brenda had demanded, the question that 800 people in a creaky auditorium in Ohio had watched her fail to answer. What have you actually accomplished? The town hall in Youngstown had lasted 90 minutes. What it started would last much, much longer. And somewhere in the digital ether on a lo-fi playlist that had no business being as popular as it was, the sound of pages turning played on an infinite loop, a 15-second monument to the night, a binder full of talking points, met a room full of people who had stopped believing in words and started demanding results.